I like to think of it like a savings account, only instead of growing interest, it was growing supper. And the flavor? That's what set it apart. Skirret was naturally sweeter than both carrots and parsnips, and those long, pale roots won quite a following. Even kings and queens couldn't resist them. They were so hooked that skirret earned a permanent spot in royal gardens. You could say it was the medieval vegetable with its very own fan club. But it wasn't just about taste. Skirret was tough, reliable, the kind of crop you could count on when the weather turned ugly. While other plants withered in the cold, these hardy roots kept putting food on the table. Old farming records even call them the comfort of the poor man's table during the lean, barren months of winter. And if that wasn't enough, skirret was downright versatile. Cooks of the time roasted it, boiled it, dropped it into stews, and even baked it into sweet pies. Honestly, it filled the same role back then that potatoes would later take on, before potatoes ever made their way to Europe. This little root was so important, it practically deserved its own coat of arms. Somewhere down the road, though, skirret slipped out of the spotlight. As farming shifted to faster growing and bigger crops, it just couldn't compete. And while skirret was fading away, another forgotten plant was starting to cause a stir in medieval gardens. The Romans were the first to carry this strong-willed plant into Britain, and before long medieval farmers grew very fond of it. Still, Alexander's wasn't the type to politely stay lined up in garden beds. It spread with the energy of a weed, yet when it came to taste, it was closer to a delicacy than a nuisance. It was almost like discovering that the neighbor who drives you crazy turns out to cook amazing meals. So what made Alexander's so impressive? The answer is that every single part of the plant had a use. Farmers and cooks could make use of its stems, leaves, flowers, roots, and even its seeds. Back then, the fresh shoots were eaten the way we might snack on celery today. The blossoms found their way into salads, and the seeds were ground up as a handy substitute for pepper. The leaves added a flavor that was unusual but pleasant, something that landed between parsley and celery, making soups and stews more interesting. The plant itself was tall, sometimes shooting up to 6 feet, with clusters of bright yellow flowers that pulled in bees and other helpful insects. And here's the thing, it grew almost anywhere. On cliffs, along the shore, or even by roadsides, Alexander's thrived without needing a farmer's hand. It was like the freelance worker of the vegetable world, never asked for, but always delivering something valuable. Yet despite all this, it gradually vanished from the table. By the 1700s, celery had pushed it out, taking over both gardens and kitchens across Europe. These days, you can still see Alexander's growing in the wild, but most people walk past without ever realizing they're ignoring a food once prized in the Middle Ages. While Alexander's was busy spreading boldly in every direction, another plant of the era held a calmer and more dignified place in gardens. Good King Henry. Why it carried such a royal name remains a mystery, but what we do know is that it was found everywhere, sprouting both in wild corners of Europe and in carefully kept plots. Growing Good King Henry is almost laughably simple. It asks for so little that it feels like letting dust gather on a bookshelf. Plant it once, and it reliably shows up again every year without replanting, returning like an old friend who never forgets to come back. If plants were asked to write up job resumes, I'm certain Good King Henry would proudly claim reliability as its strongest skill. Its nutritional power would still surprise modern health experts today. This plant had more iron than spinach and carried plenty of vitamin C, nutrients that were often scarce in medieval meals. When spring shortages hit and food ran thin, its young leaves gave people much-needed strength. Cooks of the Middle Ages prepared the shoots the same way we treat asparagus, boiled the older leaves like spinach, and even used the flower buds as tiny broccoli. It was like having a medieval 3-in-1 kitchen tool, only this one never failed to do its job. Folk medicine praised Good King Henry as well. Healers put the leaves on cuts and wounds, while tea brewed from the roots worked as a gentle laxative. In some places, people even nicknamed it All Good because of how many uses it had. But with farming turning more commercial, this sturdy but modest plant began losing ground and slowly slipped from the fields. And then came salsify, a crop that puzzled many. Was it a root, or was it something closer to seafood? Farmers didn't quite know how to classify it. What they did know was that this strange vegetable carried one of the oddest flavors in the plant world. Salsify was like the vegetable version of someone turning up at a costume party dressed as an oyster, and somehow pulling it off so well they won first prize. When cooked the right way, it really did taste like oysters. That quality made it highly prized in the Middle Ages, especially by religious communities where eating meat or fish was forbidden on certain days. Monastic records from the 1400s reveal that monks grew salsify as a direct stand-in for fish during Lent. Two types were found in gardens then, white salsify and black salsify. Both kinds had long, thin roots covered in dark skin that had to be peeled before cooking. It was the vegetable world's perfect reminder not to judge by appearances. Underneath its rough and plain surface was a refined and flavorful treat. And when the bitter cold of winter arrived, salsify proved its worth again. It was one of the rare vegetables that could stay in the soil all winter long, holding up even through freezing weather. In medieval times, people would simply dig up this root whenever they needed it through the cold months. After harvesting, it could be kept for months without going bad. In an age without refrigeration, that made it one of the most valuable foods around. As farming practices changed, salsify lost favor because it was slow to grow and didn't have the most appealing look. And speaking of odd appearances, medieval folks enjoyed another food that today's people would probably find downright strange. If someone offered you a wrinkled, squishy fruit now, most of us would probably turn it down. But back then, this odd little fruit was considered a delicacy worth waiting for. The medlar looked like a small brown apple with an open end showing 5 seeds. Straight from the tree, it was rock hard and so bitter it couldn't be eaten at all. Gardeners of the Middle Ages knew the trick, though medlars had to be blet before eating. Bletting was essentially controlled rotting, leaving the fruit for weeks until it softened and turned brown. Medieval desserts, it seems, were created by people with a lot of patience and very different standards from ours. Once properly blet, the flesh of the medlar turned sweet, with a soft texture much like cinnamon-flavored applesauce. People of the time adored it. Cookbooks from the 1200s even listed plenty of recipes, pies, jellies, and wines made from medlars. Unlike salsify, which hid its value under an unappealing skin, the medlar showed its strangeness right up front. Shoppers today expect fruit and vegetables to look flawless the moment they're picked, not something that takes weeks before it's ready to eat. Medlars asked for patience, but the next forgotten plant was almost too generous. Unlike the demanding medlar that needed special care, chickweed was never formally cultivated or given prestige. It simply appeared everywhere on its own. This little green with its tiny leaves and small white blossoms grew in gardens, fields, and even along paths throughout medieval Europe. Chickweed was like the guest who always shows up uninvited yet still brings something useful for everyone. Gardeners of the Middle Ages couldn't keep it out even if they wanted to. Farmers never planted it on purpose, and even if they tried, there was no stopping it. Chickweed could root itself in nearly any soil, sprout in any season where the ground wasn't frozen, and one plant alone could scatter thousands of seeds. Instead of tossing it aside as just another weed, medieval people learned to use it, gathering its tender leaves as a dependable source of free food. In most places, it could be collected fresh all year round. Nutritionally, chickweed was a hidden powerhouse. Pound for pound, it offered nearly 7 times more vitamin C than oranges. If vegetables in those days had titles, chickweed might have been called the official supplier of vitamin C when little else was growing. Peasants ate it regularly, but records show that even noble families set it on the table during harsh winters when fresh greens were scarce. It wasn't only for food. Chickweed also had a role in medicine. Its cooling qualities made it a treatment for rashes and skin irritation, and teas brewed from it were given to help with fevers and swelling. Modern farming, though, saw chickweed differently, spraying it with herbicides and branding it as nothing more than a weed. And while chickweed struggled to gain respect, another plant of the Middle Ages had a different problem. Its name. After all, who would want to eat something called scorzonera? It sounds more like an illness than a vegetable. Sorry, I can't come to school today. I've got scorzonera. I like to joke that I've come down with a bad case of scorzonera. Funny name aside, this oddly titled vegetable was actually a common sight in medieval gardens. Its name goes back to the Italian word scorzone, meaning venomous snake. In earlier times, herbalists believed this dark-skinned root could cure snake bites. That cure turned out to be nothing but a myth, but people quickly found something more important. Scorzonera was tasty and packed with nutrition. It was often mistaken for black salsify, a close cousin, but Scorzonera had a straighter, longer root. The outside was black, while the inside was pale white flesh. Its flavor was gentler and sweeter than salsify, with a hint of asparagus mixed with a touch of nuttiness. One of its biggest advantages, though, was how well it stored. When harvested in the fall, Scorzonera roots could be buried in sand in a cool cellar and remain fresh until the following summer. That kind of food security was rare, making it invaluable in medieval households. Records from the 1500s show it was grown widely, especially in monastery gardens. Monks loved it both for its good taste during fasting days and for the healing qualities it was believed to have. Medieval physicians recommended tea made from Scorzonera roots to cleanse the blood and ease stomach troubles. And honestly, just saying the word gave it flair. Imagine telling your neighbor, "I'm off to harvest my Scorzonera." It makes you sound like you either own a sleek foreign car or you're about to cast a spell. Scorzonera's fall from grace came much later with the rise of grocery stores and refrigeration. Once fresh produce could be bought at any time of year, there was little need for roots that stored for months underground. What began as a supposed snake cure ended up forgotten, replaced by more familiar vegetables. And speaking of names, consider the Welsh onion. Oddly enough, it's neither Welsh nor truly an onion. It's the medieval vegetable version of a knockoff product that ends up working better than the original. Its real origin lies in East Asia, and it likely reached Europe around the 1200s through trade. Medieval farmers quickly learned its value. Welsh onions were dependable, offering fresh greens year after year. What made them stand out? They're perennial, plant them once, and they'll keep coming back without replanting. Over time, each one multiplies into clumps that can easily be divided and spread. One old gardening manual from the Middle Ages claimed that a single Welsh onion plant, if carefully divided, could feed a whole family for 10 years. These onions weren't grown for show but for pure practicality, giving a steady flow of fresh green shoots at times when other vegetables had run out. Medieval cooks relied on the hollow stems to season soups, stews, and even simple salads. Their greatest strength was how tough they were in winter. Across much of Europe, Welsh onions stayed green right through the cold months, except in the very harshest conditions. They provided much-needed vitamins in those lean times. You could say Welsh onions solved their identity problem by leaning into it, neither truly Welsh nor really onions but perfectly fine with what they were. Farmers of the time valued them as reliable food, though later agriculture shifted to true onions because they offered bigger bulbs. And while Welsh onions were deliberately planted, another green of the Middle Ages wasn't planted at all. It simply arrived. That was fat hen, a wild plant that appeared uninvited in fields, gardens, and empty patches of land across Europe. Instead of pulling it as a nuisance, medieval people wisely harvested and ate it. Fat hen was like that guest who crashes dinner but surprises everyone by being the best cook in the room. It might have barged into the garden unasked, but it brought so much nutrition that people were glad to have it. Modern studies confirm just how valuable it was. More protein than cabbage, more iron than spinach, and even more calcium than kale. If medieval nutritionists had existed, they would have labeled fat hen a true superfood. Its odd name came from its usefulness as chicken feed. Hens that ate it laid more eggs and grew fatter. And if medieval vegetables had catchy slogans, fat hens would be, "Good enough for your chickens, even better for you." Archaeologists have found countless fat hen seeds in medieval waste pits, showing it was eaten often. In years of famine, this humble weed sometimes stood between people and starvation. Across medieval Europe, people prepared fat hen in all sorts of ways. Its leaves were boiled like spinach or tossed fresh into salads, and in lean times the seeds were even ground into flour. With the rise of modern farming, though, fat hen was treated as nothing but a weed competing with real crops. In the end, we threw a genuine superfood out of our kitchens just because it didn't fit the definition of a proper crop. And while fat hen was struggling to get respect, another herb was fighting not to lose the respect it already had. How could a plant that flavored nearly everything simply vanish from our gardens? This was lovage, a true culinary favorite that somehow slipped into obscurity. Unlike fat hen, which never had fame, lovage was a star in its day. Roman soldiers carried its seeds as they marched across Europe, planting it wherever they made camp. Monks in the Middle Ages carried on the tradition, making sure every monastery garden had at least one lovage plant. The flavor of lovage was strong, far stronger than the greens we know today. Imagine a mix of celery and parsley, but magnified 10 times. Lovage was like celery on steroids, the version that had gone to the gym and bulked up on flavor. Medieval cooks leaned on it constantly. A single sprig was enough to season an entire pot of soup. Dried leaves were scattered over meats, while the seeds were crushed and used in bread making. Even the roots were boiled and eaten the same way as parsnips. And perhaps most surprising of all, the hollow stems were cooked down into candied sweets. Beyond cooking, lovage had real value as medicine. The whole plant carried oils that helped digestion, reduced bloating, and worked as a gentle diuretic. Writings from the 13th century record lovage tea being given for stomach troubles and kidney ailments. What made it even more impressive was how long it lasted. A lovage plant could live up to 20 years, grow more than 6 feet tall, and deliver huge amounts of flavor from just a corner of the garden. This plant was incredibly tough, able to survive bitter winters and bounce back strong every spring. I can imagine medieval gardeners shaking their heads at us today. Wait, you stopped growing a crop that flavors everything, lasts for decades, and even helps your stomach? Did you all swap your brains for turnips? But as new spices came into Europe through trade, lovage slowly slipped out of favor. And while lovage faded into the background, another forgotten green had its own battle, thanks to a name that confused everyone. No, it doesn't have the slightest thing to do with corn. Yet for centuries, corn salad has carried the burden of that unlucky name. Where lovage was forgotten, corn salad was simply misunderstood. The odd name came from the fact that it often appeared in grain fields. Back then, Europeans used the word corn to mean grain, long before maize from the Americas ever showed up. These little greens sprouted naturally after harvest in autumn and stayed alive through the cold winter months. It was a bit like that quiet kid at school. Easy to overlook because of a funny nickname, but once you paid attention, you realized they were fascinating. Medieval farmers figured out these wild greens were not only safe to eat, but tasty too. Corn salad had a gentle, nutty flavor without the harsh bitterness that came with so many other wild plants. The leaves could be picked all winter long, right when fresh vegetables were hardest to find. If we put it under a modern microscope, the nutrition would impress anyone. About 3 times the omega-3s of iceberg lettuce, along with solid amounts of iron and vitamin C. People in the Middle Ages clearly knew its worth, especially in the dead of winter. Corn salad might be the only vegetable to suffer both from an identity crisis and a marketing problem. What it really needed back then was a good PR campaign. Contains absolutely no corn. But modern farming preferred lettuces that stored longer and were easier to grow at scale, leaving corn salad behind. And just as it was disappearing, another old favorite was running into its own trouble. Not because of a bad name, but because of its bold, overpowering taste. Too strong for modern palates? That was tansy. Back then, medieval cooks swore by it, but today it's almost completely abandoned. Tansy grows like a bushy herb with fern-shaped leaves and clusters of bright yellow button-like flowers. Every part of tansy carried a strong hit of aroma, a complicated mix of bitterness, spice, and a touch of sweetness that people in the Middle Ages loved. Modern science has confirmed that tansy leaves hold more than 40 different flavor compounds. If herbs were rock bands, tansy would be the one blasting so loud the neighbors called the cops. Medieval cookbooks included tansy in all kinds of recipes, both savory and sweet. One of the most famous was tansy pudding for Easter, made by mixing chopped leaves with eggs, cream, breadcrumbs, and sugar, then frying it into a thick cake. During spring festivals, cheese flavored with tansy was popular, and even ale was brewed with tansy on special occasions. But tansy wasn't just about taste. Its strong oils acted as a natural preservative, keeping meat and baked goods fresher for longer. A huge advantage in a world without refrigeration. The plant was also important in medicine. Tansy tea was brewed to fight intestinal worms, ease digestion, and reduce fevers. Monasteries always grew it, not just for cooking and remedies, but also near doors, where its sharp smell helped drive away flies and insects. If modern chefs had to describe it, they'd probably call tansy loud, the culinary version of writing in all caps. As time went on, milder herbs like parsley became more fashionable, and tansy slipped quietly out of the kitchen. And while tansy disappeared for being too bold, another plant vanished for the opposite reason: it was far too easy to ignore. Unlike tansy, which demanded attention, sea kale asked for nothing. This plant grew naturally along the northern coasts of Europe, and for medieval communities it was a dependable source of food. Sea kale thrived in sandy, salty soil where most vegetables would die. It was like that friend who always brings food to gatherings without being asked, but somehow never gets invited to the big events. Medieval people harvested it in two ways. In spring, the young blanched shoots were eaten like asparagus, and later, the larger leaves were cooked down like cabbage. Unlike many other wild greens, sea kale wasn't bitter at all. It was gentle and slightly sweet. What really made it stand out, though, was the amount of vitamin C it carried, by weight 6 times more than lemons. For fishing towns that had little access to fresh produce, sea kale often meant protection from scurvy. Letting sea kale slip out of our diet is like forgetting to pick up free cash lying around. It still grows along the shoreline, loaded with flavor and nutrition, and yet most people just walk right past it. As this plant faded into obscurity, another unusual crop was dealing with a different kind of problem: its double identity. This one was truly odd. Woad was mainly cultivated for producing blue dye, but medieval people also ate it. Unlike sea kale, which was prized just for food, woad lived 2 lives at once. The blue pigment pressed from its leaves colored fabric, painted banners, and even marked warriors going into battle. Before woad, finding blue cloth was about as likely as finding silence at a child's birthday party. Possible in theory, but rarely seen. Here's the surprising part. Before woad plants produced their dyeing compounds, the young leaves were perfectly edible. Farmers gathered those first tender greens each spring, tossing them into salads or simmering them in soups. They had a mild taste with a peppery kick, much like young mustard leaves. Raising woad, however, came with one big drawback: the smell. To make the blue pigment, the leaves had to be fermented, and the odor was so awful that kings and princes issued laws banning the process near their homes. It was the medieval version of that one food that makes your kitchen stink for days. And while woad struggled with being both a dye and a food, another humble vegetable part was suffering from being ignored. Turnips were well known, of course. They fed peasants all across Europe, but people often overlooked half their potential. What many people don't realize is that in medieval times, farmers prized the leafy tops of turnips just as much as the roots underneath. It's kind of like buying a smartphone and only using it as a clock. You're ignoring its best features. Turnip greens were loaded with nutrition: 4 times more calcium, 3 times more vitamin A, and twice the protein compared to the roots. Peasants would snip the outer leaves during the season, making sure the root itself kept growing. These greens ended up in soups, stews, and salads, adding a slightly peppery bite to meals that otherwise could be plain and dull through the winter. Honestly, turnip greens deserve a comeback. They've been kept in the shadows too long while the root takes all the praise. From skirret at the start to turnip greens at the end, these 15 forgotten vegetables remind us of just how much knowledge we've let slip away about the foods that once kept our ancestors alive.